Alright, this video is going to introduce us into the era that's going to take place immediately following World War II, and we got a lot to cover, so I'm going to get into it, but we're going to talk about all the things on the screen. Alright, so the Cold War, it's actually going to be a time, just an era of political tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. We don't actually go to war with each other, which is good because we got a ton of nukes. It's once we get kind of a few years into the war, into this Cold War era, we got a ton of nukes. So if we actually went into armed conflict with each other directly, we probably wouldn't be here today. All right, and so, but there are a lot of small little like proxy wars that are going to take place. And what I mean by that is that there's going to be some wars that are going to break out between us and the Soviet Union, but really it's not going to be between us and the Soviet Union. It's going to be us in Vietnam, us in Korea, all right, where we're going to be battling their beliefs, and they're going to send weapons. And we're going to do the same thing to like Afghanistan, where they'll invade Afghanistan. We'll send the Afghans weapons to fight them off. So it's going to be a lot of like smaller scale wars where we don't fight each other directly, but like one side will help the other, and one side will send troops, the other side will send equipment, and so then they'll just be basically fighting wars, but without fighting each other technically, so they don't get too mad. All right, so that's going to be one of your terms. Satellite states is another one. These are countries that are politically and economically dependent upon the Soviet Union. Now, this is going to get confusing. So a satellite state, I go to Cedar Creek Church. They have satellite campuses around the area, which means they have one location, but it like kind of branches out into many different locations. And so that's kind of like it's one location, it's one central church, but it has many different branches, and that's kind of what is going to happen with the Soviet Union here. They're going to have, it's going to be the Soviet Union, but they will have these satellite states that are going to mirror what the Soviet Union believes. All right, that they're going to have these the same beliefs. They're going to be kind of forced to have the same beliefs that the Soviet Union has. All right, so because we are going to talk about actual satellites, so it's going to get weird when I say satellites and then satellite states. The arms race is going to be the United States and the Soviet Union building up their armies, but more specifically nuclear weapons. All right, and we're going to talk a ton about the development of nuclear weapons. All right, the United States and the Soviet Union. After World War II, the Soviets defeat the Germans from the east. We defeat the Germans from the west. We drop an atomic bomb on Japan. All right, so we are really the two major superpowers, but we couldn't be more different. Couldn't be more different. One side believes in free democratic elections. They hated communism. That's the United States. Did not. They feared the spread of communism, and the goal is to contain the spread of communism. They didn't want it to spread anywhere else. They didn't necessarily want to just destroy it, but they just wanted to keep it where it was, all right, because they thought that it wasn't right. All right? Whereas obviously communists hated capitalism. All right? They believed in the totalitarian communist rule. They feared the spread of capitalism, and their goal was to spread communism around the world. All right, so that's where you're going to put that stuff right in here. All right. Basically, the reason why this whole thing's going to start, if you remember, so during World War II, the Soviet Union is going to be driving the Germans back. So the Germans make it pretty far into Soviet territory. After Stalingrad and the Battle of Kursk, they start to drive them back. All right, and the Germans retreat, and then once D-Day occurs, we push from the west, and we end up closing in on Germany and defeating them. All right, but what happens though is that as the Soviet Union pushes the Nazis out, Stalin says, "Yeah, we're going to stay here. All right, we're going to stay in these areas, and we're going to make sure that they become communist." All right, and that's going to be the satellite states that are going to be created. All right, because they want to create these kind of this buffer zone. All right, so the Soviet Union is going to add these Soviet satellites to create a buffer zone, and that's what you're going to put there. Why were these satellites? Why did they acquire satellite nations after World War II? All right, because they wanted to have that buffer zone. All right, they just got attacked from the west. So they want to make sure that they have an area that is separating themselves from the West. So basically they want to surround themselves with countries that believe how they believe, where they won't have a fear from being attacked. All right, so that's going to create a buffer zone or a barrier between themselves and Western European countries, because Stalin didn't trust them. All right, so we just got attacked by them. I'm going to make sure that we keep them this way. And now this violates the agreements they had. I think it was Yalta. It might have been Potsdam. One of the I think it was Potsdam. Basically, they agreed that these nations that are liberated from the Nazis, because remember, these countries have no government in place. They've been controlled by the Nazis for years, so they have no government in place. and the Soviets they agreed upon with the United States and Britain that, hey, we're going to let them pick and choose these when we relieve these countries what type of government they want to be, and they all agree upon that. And then Stalin's like, nah, just kidding, I ain't gonna let that happen. All right, and so then Winston Churchill goes in front of, and this is all kind of happening, and people aren't paying a ton of attention to it, but then Winston Churchill goes in front of the United States. He's in the United States. He's no longer the prime minister at the time. Winston Churchill was the prime minister of Britain during World War II. He goes in front of the United States and he says, we got a problem brewing. All right. So he says, yes, the war is over. This is in 1946. So he goes up in front of the world after everybody's like, finally, the war is over. And I think it's in March of 1946. Gives this speech. The war ended in August of 45. So this is 6 months later. He gives this speech and he says, hey, I know everybody's super psyched about the war, but we got a problem. There's an Iron Curtain descending across the continent. All right, there is a massive division that is occurring, this red line. It's not an actual real curtain. Some people actually think they actually built an Iron Curtain like a wall. And it's not an actual curtain, but he's basically saying Europe's divided. We got a problem, all right, because the Soviets are spreading their influence and they're going to divide Europe, and we've got another issue brewing. All right, and so here's the example of the Iron Curtain at the time. Czechoslovakia will eventually fall as well. All right, so there's a couple things that are going to take place. There's a couple key pieces of legislation. All right, I'll go to the if you looked at this part, by the way, it says Soviet satellites. These are the countries under Soviet control. I meant to explain that. All right, you're just going to talk about these here: Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary. You'll have East Germany, Czechoslovakia. All right. So those countries there will go. Oops. They'll go here. All right. Czechoslovakia happens later, so I think that's why that one's not on there. All right, so there's going to be two key pieces of legislation that you'll have to know. Harry Truman is going to be the president. He's the one that decides to drop the atomic bomb on Japan. He takes over after FDR. He's going to sign a Truman Doctrine in March, a year after the Iron Curtain speech, where he basically says any country that wants help from being taken over, I will provide them aid. Any country that wants to resist forced subjugation, is the word he used. He didn't actually go out and say communism because that would have been a threat. But he's like, basically, if you want to fight against tyranny, we will give you our full support. In whatever way you want. So if you're being attacked from within, we will help you. We will pledge to help you. And basically, what he's saying is, we're going to contain communism. We are going to fight to preserve freedom wherever we can. And he used those terms, but really what he's saying is any place that is a communist uprising, if you desire our help, appeal to the United States and we will help you. It's very different than anything else that's happened. Usually the United States is like, that's a you problem. Stay over there. That's not our problem. That's not what Truman's saying now. Truman is kind of reversing policy, and he's saying, if you need help, we will help you. We will give aid to any country threatened by communism. Our military force will give you weapons. We'll give you anything you need to help you to remain free and to fight off communism. Because the United States did not want communism to spread. All right, so that's one way that the United States, that's one piece of legislation that the United States is going to have. All right, it was a policy created to contain communism to Western Europe, and they would do that by providing military aid, weapons, etc. So help anybody that wanted to resist it. All right, now the Marshall Plan. Now this is an easy way to kind of, not to confuse these. Think of alliteration. Money, Marshall. Money Marshall. It's technically called the European Economic Recovery Plan. Oops, I just messed that up. All right, it was known for basically helping countries to rebuild, and he basically was the whole logic behind this was what happened after World War I. Well, financial chaos. occurred with the Great Depression. And what happened? Extreme parties rose into power. You have the Nazis, the fascists. You have all sorts of dictators rising up into power. And so Marshall comes up with this plan. George Marshall comes up with this plan, and he says, let's give these countries money. Let's help them out so that they can rebuild. Because if they slip into economic chaos, because remember, these countries are destroyed by the Nazis. If they slip into economic chaos, we're going to be right back into another war again, because that'll lead way to extremists rising into power. And so we want to try to prevent. So Truman Doctrine is going to be more reactive, like, hey, if you got an uprising, we'll help you. This is like, hey, let's be proactive. Let's prevent a problem before it happens. Let's give money, financial assistance to these countries to prevent chaos from breaking out. You can see it all went to Western Europe. The Soviets and the satellites, they offered it to them as well, but they refused to take it. They thought that they were trying to buy their alliance, which is probably true. And so they refused the money from the Marshall Plan, but the European countries that used U.S. money was very successful. They were very successful. They turned around. Europe is going to start to thrive pretty quickly as a result of that. And so what do they have in common? Well, one is to fight an uprising as it's occurring. One is to prevent an uprising from occurring. But their main goal is to fight the spread of communism. They want to try to preserve democracy and fight communism. All right, and then a couple things we're going to talk about too is Germany is going to be divided. All right, so Germany is going to be divided into 4 zones. All right, after the war, because they have no government, the Nazis have fallen, they take it and they divide it between the 4 sides of the war. The United States gets a section, Britain gets a section, the Soviet Union gets a section, and France, for whatever reason, gets a section. Yeah, you guys fought in the war pretty hard for a month. Here's a section. And so Germany's divided, and you can see Berlin is divided the same way. Berlin, this little area, it's divided into 4 zones as well. There's a Soviet zone, a U.S. zone, Britain, and France. All right, and so the Soviet Union does not like having an American presence, a Western presence, a democratic, capitalist presence in their territory. So you see this whole zone is the Soviet Union zone. They don't like that there's a democratic presence there because Berlin is in their zone. All right, and so what they're going to do is they're going to say, well, you know what? Let's get them out of here. Let's get these out of here so we can have all of Berlin. All right, and so the Soviets opposed the occupation of West Berlin. So what they started doing is they started to blockade supplies from coming in. All right, they started to block supplies from coming in. Basically, they were hoping that they could starve the Allies out of Berlin. All right, so they're going to try to get them out of Berlin, try to starve them out. West Berlin is deep in their territory, and they're like, you know what, we're not going to let you get supplies to these people, and they're going to starve. We're going to cut off electricity, we'll cut off water. Stalin is kind of making a power play right away, and this is going to be really the first major conflict of the Cold War. He's like, what are you going to do about it? The United States, you're going to give in to us? Because that's what they wanted. And so how are you going to solve this? Where they shut off all roads and railways leading into their country, they can no longer supply these people, they cut them off from electricity. The United States, France, and Britain, they have to figure out a way to supply these people, but they obviously don't want to start a war with the Soviets. All right, and so that's where we're going to pick up with our next activity with the Berlin blockade.